And this presentation is for RSCH 8111, a qualitative research methods class. We're going to take a few minutes to talk about discourse analysis. There's three general objectives to the presentation. We'll just kind of talk about basic ideas related to discourse analysis, look at just an introduction to the approaches that are useful for discourse analysis. Then we'll critique one article that uses discourse analysis to evaluate case studies for health policy. You know, you may not think about it much, but exactly what is discourse? What is discourse? Well, it's a system of meaning or ideology that's propagated through everyday language use. It includes recordings or examples of communicative action through language. It includes communication structure and intended use. The language can take many forms, and it's shaped by the context. So if it's shaped by the context, this means that there can be multiple meanings, and its influence, the interpretation of the discourse can be influenced by the participants and the time and exactly the power relationships of the people involved. Wetherell has a definition of discourse I really liked. He defines discourse as human meaning making, and this comes from his book, Discourse Theory and Practice. So Wetherell believed that if we can construct meaning, then with thoughtful analysis we should be able to deconstruct meaning and better understand what's happening with discourse. To understand discourse analysis, you have to consider a philosophy, social constructionism. Social constructionism is a philosophical view of the world. It's the idea that knowledge in the world around us is not real in and of itself, that the world is given meaning through human experience. This idea is rooted in what's called symbolic interactionism. So the notion that social construct of reality is mediated by social interactions. And this idea gained popularity after Berger and Luckman published a book entitled The Social Construction of Reality in 1966. Linguistics is also related or underpins discourse analysis. So linguistics involves the sounds of words and words themselves, and syntax and semantics, and the way that words are arranged in relative to context. And that rolls up to discourse, so that discourse is the language use beyond that of the individual sentence. Discourse can be complex. Take for example this cartoon. Without understanding recent news releases and elements that are in the news today, you would have a hard time understanding what this cartoon means. But it actually says a lot just in a picture. Discourse includes how we interpret the communication. Who's permitted to speak, what types of information counts as truth, what even are appropriate topics that are allowed to be discussed. It also includes how we come to know or understand what it is that we know. In fact, discourse constructs the very things that we are trying to describe. Consider how these statements differ. I need for you to be here at 6 p.m. That takes kind of an authoritative or demanding tone. Could you be here at 6 p.m.? This is a little bit softened. It would really help if you could be here at 6 p.m. This is even a little softer from the first statement. And I can pay you $20 to be here at 6 p.m. We've now moved from kind of a command or an instruction down to where you're negotiating for an action. While all these sentences contain similar words, they have different meanings. Let's look at how art can communicate. This is a image taken of graffiti on a wall. If you were from a different time or a different world, you might not be able to understand these symbols, but at least we can look at these symbols and it means a lot by the way they're arranged. We can gain great meaning here from here the statement saying that the what comes from the heart is greater than money. Here's an illustration by one of my favorite illustrators, Norman Rockwell. Rockwell was born before the 1900 and was very popular from up through the 1950s. And this is an illustration entitled Stuck Inside. So you see a young boy looking at a book. Now think about if we were to do this same illustration today. The young boy, instead of looking at a book, he might be looking at an iPad or a Kindle. And then the barrel in the photograph, I wouldn't even know where you would go to get a barrel today. Or the true tin can sitting on the barrel. Today that might be some kind of plastic item. Or the fishing pole, literally a pole. Today it would be some kind of a fiberglass pole. So the point I'm making is that if you were to recreate this image today, to get a similar meaning, it would use very different articles and take a very different approach. It would look very different than it did in the 40s or 50s when it was painted. So things change with time is the point I'm making. Consider the meaning here. This is a quote by Zora Neale Hurston. If you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. Now, if you don't know much about Hurston, you may want to look up her biography. She was born in Alabama in 1891, was later educated at Columbia. She was a novelist, a folklorist, an anthropologist. She was best known for her 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. In 1937, she had a grant to do ethnographic studies in Jamaica and Haiti. So from this quote, I think that you can recognize that Hurston understood something about discourse. She understood that there was a relationship between power and discourse, and that if you said nothing, that someone or some entity, some institution would fill that void and say something for you and interpret the meaning for you. So we've talked about discourse. What is discourse analysis? Well, discourse analysis is a broad term for the study of the ways in which language is used, both in text and context, or it's also called discourse studies. It's difficult to talk about discourse analysis without mentioning Michel Foucault. If you're not familiar with Foucault, you might want to look up his biography. He was French. He was a philosopher, a historian, and a very prolific writer. He was early on pointed out the relationships between discourse and power. He wrote about prisons and the legal system, about doctors and psychiatry. He actually grew up wealthy in elite circles, and at one time was even an altar boy. One of his early famous works was something entitled, a piece entitled Madness and Civilization, published in 1961. He wrote another famous book called Discipline and Punishment, published in 1975. He went back and would use history, go back in time and read pieces of historical works, and was able to show how people in institutions and people in position of power would use discourse to maintain power, and with time discourse would be used to shape ideas and influence discourse, and was involved with controlling segments of the population. So we have an article to look at for discussion. The title of the article is Applying Discourse Analysis in Health Policy Research, Case Studies in Regional, Organizational, and Global Health by Evans Agnew, Johnson, Liu, and Boutain. This article was published in the journal Policy, Politics, and Nursing Practice. The authors here in this article open up by giving kind of an overview of discourse analysis. They talk about the topic, how discourse analysis is used, how it can be used to try to understand social practices. They lay out how they're going to use discourse analysis in these case studies. They outline relevant policy. They place the policy in a context, and they located data sources that they would then use to address the topics that are to be analyzed for the case studies. There's 3 examples of 3 case studies used. Dr. Liu uses in a case study policies about preconceptive care in China, and she uses a theoretical approach that she had copied from Faircloth in a work from 2009. Evan Agnew's looks at state policies on asthma management, and Agnew uses a social cognitive theory method, copies that from Van Dyke from 2009. And then Johnson uses a case study looking at hospital policies development on bullying, and she uses a psychological inception method taken from Willig in 2009. So Dr. Liu, in looking at preconception care in China, she looked at publications, official publications put out by the Chinese government, and she interviewed women living in rural areas of China. And, first of all, Liu was Chinese, and she spoke Chinese, and I think that is probably an important point. It would be very difficult for someone that didn't speak Chinese to interview in a different language. That would probably change the interpretation that you come up with. But she looking at the publications, the Chinese publications, she found that they intermingled traditional medicine with more modern biomedicine. That both of those terms and concepts were interwoven or coexisted in the policy text. She also, from the interviews, found that the participants considered the national policies as somewhat of a formality that was loosely related to their actual social practices. And she also, from talking with the rural residents, the women in rural areas of China, she found that the villagers would have been open to policy ideas if they were approached with a discursive strategy that engaged the local women. Evans Agnew looked at asthma management, and she analyzed the transcripts that were used by during the development of the formal policies for asthma management in the state of Washington. And what she found was that there were power relationships played a role in the formation of the final policy. She looked at what took place during the open discussions. She found that some of the individuals leading the discussions would cut people off or misdirect them away from certain topics. For example, when the issue of disparities in asthma care was brought up, how some groups, some minority groups might have greater prevalence of asthma issues, and that the policy somehow should direct that or answer or address that the policymakers, the people leading the discussion, would shift the topic away or cut it short. When someone brought up the topic of housing disparities and how the type of housing you were in was related to asthma, this was minimized. Also, when she looked at the makeup of the components of the panel that were making decisions for the state policy, she suggested that more diversity was needed in the panel. Out of the 15 or 17 so people that were on the panel, the majority were white, and with a not enough diverse representation of minority on the panel. Johnson looked at a hospital's panel, a policy on bullying, and she was able to look at the policy itself and the transcripts that went into formalizing or making the hospital's policy on bullying. And what she found is by looking at the policy itself and the way the policy was used, is that the policies were not made fully public, so that managers could decide when and how to enforce the policy on bullying, because not everyone knew about the policy or understood that there was what was contained in the policy. Some managers suggested that the policy was under actual human resources, belonged to human resource department, and was really to be used if a grievance was filed. So by placing the control of the policy under a different department, it suggested that the managers were able to distance themselves from the policy itself. Also, Johnson found by looking at the policy that it emphasized patient safety or patient bullying, and kind of downplayed employee safety or the fact that employees could be bullied, so that in reality the employee bullying was kind of marginalized or not really addressed. And all this Johnson was able to identify by looking at the written policy and the interview transcripts as the policy was developed. So in conclusion, discourse analysis represents a useful approach in understanding policy formation. If you look at how themes are there, and how, if you ask the question, who's in a position of power relative to the information or discourse that's being presented, it allows you to understand or give meaning to the discourse analysis and policies that may be developed. In this article, the authors demonstrated how transcripts and interviews can be used to deconstruct elements and power relationships and come to a better understanding of gaps that may be in the policy, or how policies could be improved. The authors were able to show that discourse analysis can be used at the national, state, or local policies. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope you found the information useful.